The Force is old and full of shadows.
The younglings felt it first. Across a dozen systems, children who had barely learned to quiet their minds woke screaming from dreamless sleep. On Coruscant, a 4-year-old girl pressed her palms flat against the cold floor of the temple dormitory and couldn't explain the sound she heard, not with her ears, with something deeper. Something that had no name in Basic. A master on night watch found her sitting upright in the dark, eyes open, repeating the same word in a language she had never been taught. Revan, on Korriban, dead and desiccated as it was, the Sith holocrons in the deepest vault of what had once been an academy, flickered simultaneously. Not a power surge, not seismic activity. Every one of them simply activated, for exactly 4 seconds, then went dark again. The tomb rats that had colonized the lower halls bolted upward, through 17 floors of crumbling stone, and didn't stop running when they reached open sky. On Mandalore, 3 herd animals standing motionless in a snowfield turned their heads in perfect unison toward the east and did not look away. The Force does not scream like this without cause. It does not pull at the roots of living things without reason. Something had shifted in the deep architecture of the galaxy. Not a battle, not a death, not the ordinary violence of a civilization at war with itself. Something older than the war. Something that had been waiting. The ruins of Lihan had no name in current star charts. The Rakata who built the Starforge called their homeworld the Infinite Empire's Cradle. The Republic cartographers who briefly surveyed it 4 centuries ago logged it as an uninhabited debris field orbiting a dying star, and moved on. The jungle had swallowed every carved stone, every black monolith, every doorway. The ocean had eaten the coastlines. Whatever the Rakata had been, the galaxy had agreed, quietly and collectively, to forget them. The stasis pod was 200 meters below the surface, beneath the foundation of a structure that no longer existed above ground. The access tunnel had collapsed in at least 3 places. The security field around the pod, Rakatan in origin, jury-rigged with components that postdated the Infinite Empire by 3,000 years, had been running on reserve power for longer than the Republic had existed. It ran out at dawn, local time. The seal broke with a sound like a held breath finally released. A mechanical exhalation, long and slow, and then the hiss of atmosphere equalizing. Stale. Cold air from inside the pod meeting the humid dark of the buried chamber. Dust moved. Ancient particulate that had been undisturbed for 3 centuries drifted in the faint light of failing Rakatan panels. Then a hand, slow and deliberate, pressed flat against the interior of the pod door from inside. His first breath was not a gasp. It was measured, controlled, in through the nose, a 4 count, filling the lungs entirely, cataloging the air, damp stone, ozone from the dying panels, the faint mineral trace of Lehan's underground water table. He held it, released it, did it again. His second act was not to open his eyes. He reached into the Force. It came to him the way it always had, not rushing in, not flooding, but rising steadily, like water finding its level. He extended his awareness outward in concentric rings. The chamber first, 12 meters by 8, no living presence within sensor range, structural integrity compromised but not immediately dangerous. The surface above, jungle, rain, the ambient noise of an ecosystem that had never learned to fear humans because humans hadn't come here in a very long time. The planet itself, dead civilization, living wilderness, nothing that posed a threat. Then further, he pushed his awareness past the atmosphere, past the gravity well, into the force current that connected living systems across the galaxy. He did it slowly because he already suspected what he would find, and he had learned, at enormous cost, the discipline of confirming before reacting. What he found was wrong. Not broken. Not dying. Starved on one side and gorged on the other. Someone had been doing this deliberately, with patience and with craft, feeding darkness into the structural tissue of galactic civilization at a rate slow enough to escape detection, but fast enough to be, after sufficient decades, catastrophic. He had seen this technique in Sith texts so old they predated written Basic. He had, to his enduring shame, helped refine it once, in a life he had spent every year since trying to account for. He knew the shape of this. He knew who built things that way. He opened his eyes. The mask was in a sealed compartment to his left, exactly where he'd placed it. He lifted it out with both hands. The Beskar was cold, deeply foundationally cold, the way metal gets when it has been sealed from heat for centuries rather than hours. The T-shaped visor caught the faint light of the dying panels. He turned it once, slowly, checking the exterior, checking the seal on the interior padding, checking the ventilation servos along the jaw with one thumb. The mechanism was stiff. He worked it back and forth 4 times until it moved freely. He held it at arm's length for a moment, looking at it, looking back at him. Then, he put it on. The servos engaged. The seal pressed against his face. The HUD flickered once, twice, then stabilized. Most functions dead after 3 centuries without power, but the visual enhancement and atmosphere filters still running on the passive cell he'd built into the cheek plate specifically because he knew he might wake somewhere dark. The sabers came next. Both of them, resting in the same compartment beneath foam padding that had compressed and dried to powder centuries ago. He ignited each one briefly, checking the crystals, checking the plasma containment, and extinguished them. One purple, one red. He clipped both to his belt without ceremony. He stood. His legs held. The force helped where the muscles hadn't fully remembered their job yet. He stood in the dark of a dead civilization's basement and breathed and waited for the weakness to pass. And it did, because he had trained that response into himself across enough lifetimes that even 3 centuries of stasis hadn't entirely erased it. He climbed out. Coruscant took 11 days. Revan moved through the underworld's data den district like a man who knew exactly where everything was and had no interest in being seen. The information broker who tried to follow him from the 3rd terminal hub remembered only that his feet had taken him in the wrong direction for approximately 40 minutes before the fog cleared, and by then the hooded figure was gone. The data terminal cost him nothing but time. He sliced it with tools he fabricated from components purchased across 6 separate vendors in 3 different sectors, a precaution so old it was essentially reflex. The holonet opened in front of him. He read for 6 hours without moving. He read the war. Both sides of it, not the propaganda each faction fed its own population, but the economic architecture underneath, the voting records in the Senate, the troop movements that made strategic sense and the ones that didn't, the Military Creation Act and the emergency power statutes it had enabled, the scope of authority those statutes had placed in the hands of a single office without sunset clause or Senate recall mechanism. He read the Jedi Order's casualty reports. He read the names of fallen masters and recognized some of the lineages. He read the dossier of a Supreme Chancellor who had been extended emergency powers without time limit by a Senate that no longer remembered how to disagree with him. He sat with that for a long time. Then he read the file on Anakin Skywalker, highest midi-chlorian count ever recorded. Jedi Knight. Born on Tatooine, found at 9, trained under Obi-Wan Kenobi, hero of the Outer Rim campaigns, personal relationship with the Supreme Chancellor dating back to the Naboo blockade. Revan closed the terminal. Outside the den, Coruscant's underworld breathed its usual toxic life around him, the smell of recycled air and spilled food and ship fuel, and too many people in too small a space. A drunk slept against the wall to his left. 3 children ran past without looking at him. 2 levels above, he could hear the bass thrum of a speeder race that someone was illegally broadcasting on the public frequency. He stood in the middle of it and did not move for almost a full minute. The Sith had not gone. They had simply learned, after the thought bomb and Ruzan and 100 other defeats, to stop fighting wars and start growing them instead. To find a system, a republic, an order, a democracy, and feed it the right fears in the right sequence until it consumed itself without ever knowing it had been steered. He had seen this blueprint before. He had helped write it. He pulled his hood forward and walked toward the transit hub. There was a war to end. There was a chosen one who had been handed to the wrong architect. There was a shadow sitting in an office at the top of the world's tallest building, and it had been there long enough. He was done waiting. The Jedi Temple at midday. 5 spires cutting upward through Coruscant's perpetual haze. The ancient stone catching the filtered sun at an angle that made the structure look almost warm. From the landing platform on the temple's eastern face, the city sprawled outward in every direction, towers and transit lines and the endless low roar of 17 trillion lives conducting their business beneath a sky that was more exhaust than atmosphere. The temple rose above all of it, and pretended, as it always had, to be separate from it. It was not separate. It had never been separate. It simply hadn't noticed yet. In the council chamber at the highest spire, 12 seats arranged in their eternal circle caught the afternoon light through floor to ceiling transparent steel. 4 of the seats were empty, masters deployed to the outer rim to Felucia, to 3 different systems where the Separatist advance had not yet been halted. The remaining 8 sat in the particular stillness of people who had trained themselves out of visible fatigue so thoroughly that exhaustion no longer showed on their faces. It showed in the Force. Mace Windu felt it in himself every morning now, a density behind the sternum that meditation could reduce, but not eliminate. The war had been running for 3 years. The casualty reports arrived daily. The gap between what the Order was and what the galaxy needed it to be had been widening. Quietly, for longer than 3 years, the war had simply made the gap visible. He was thinking about this when the perimeter alert activated. The alert was not a breach warning. It was something the temple's force-sensitive monitoring architecture, a passive system woven into the building's foundations by masters who had been dead for 8 centuries, was not designed to trigger on. Not an intrusion. Not a weapon signature. Not an unauthorized vessel. A presence. The system had flagged it because the presence was large, not physically, but in the Force, the way a star is large, the way gravity is large, and moving with complete deliberateness toward the temple's main entrance on foot, at walking pace, without any attempt at concealment. Mace was at the main entrance in 4 minutes. He brought Plo Koon and Ki-Adi-Mundi without discussion. The 3 of them took positions at the top of the temple steps without a word exchanged. Below, the broad public approach stretched downward toward the Coruscant street level, and on it, walking up the center of the steps with the unhurried pace of someone who had already decided how this meeting would go, was a figure in dark robes. Masked, Mace registered the twin lightsabers at the belt. Registered the posture. Not aggressive, not deferential. The posture of someone who had learned to be the most dangerous thing in a room so long ago that they no longer needed to perform it. He registered the mask. T-shaped visor. Old design, old material, the kind of wear pattern that didn't come from years but from centuries. The figure stopped 3 steps below them. Silence. The ambient noise of Coruscant pressed in from every direction, and the 3 Jedi Masters and the masked stranger stood in a quiet that had nothing to do with the absence of sound. "You're not here to fight," Mace said. "Not a question." "No," said a voice from behind the mask, low, calibrated, carrying no more or less weight than the statement required. "I'm here because you need to understand what you're losing, and I'm one of perhaps 3 beings in the galaxy still alive who can explain it to you clearly." Plo Koon's presence in the Force tightened almost imperceptibly. Ki-Adi-Mundi said nothing, but his hand moved 1 centimeter toward his saber and stopped there. The masked figure watched all of this. "I know," he said. "Take your time." The council chamber with 12 seats had 8 masters in it. The masked figure stood in its center and did not sit, which was not offered, and did not remove the mask, which was not requested. Mace had his arms folded. Yoda in his chair had his eyes closed, which meant he was listening more carefully than anyone else in the room. "You know what the war is," Revan said. Not an accusation. A starting point. A conflict between the Republic and the Confederacy of Independent Systems, Ki-Adi-Mundi said. You are fighting the symptoms, Revan said, of a Sith grand plan that has been running for approximately 1,000 years. The Separatist leadership is a managed opposition. Count Dooku is an apprentice. His master sits inside your government, has been sitting inside your government for 13 years, and has used the emergency powers your Senate handed him to build the infrastructure of a dictatorship inside the existing architecture of a democracy. The war ends when Dooku's master is removed, not before. The chamber was quiet for a moment that stretched. You're describing a conspiracy, Mace said carefully, that would require an active Sith Lord to have successfully deceived the Jedi Order for over a decade. Yes, we would have sensed, you didn't. Revan's voice did not rise. I'm not saying this to wound your pride. I'm saying it because the mechanism that blinded you is the same mechanism that confirms for you, right now, in this conversation. A low-level background sense that everything is probably fine. It's a force concealment technique developed across a millennium specifically to defeat Jedi perception. You have been seeing through a filter you didn't know existed, and I need you to understand that before anything else, because everything else depends on it. Yoda opened his eyes. The old master studied the masked figure for a long moment, with the particular quality of attention that made younger Jedi feel transparent. Whatever he found, his expression didn't settle into comfort. Something in his bearing shifted. Not alarm, but the specific reorientation of a mind that has just encountered information that rearranges what came before it. Sense you. I do, Yoda said slowly. Old, very old. Both sides of the force within you, not fighting. Settled, he paused. Seen this once before, I have. In the archives. In records of a war before memory. Revan said nothing. The mask, Yoda said. The description of the mask, there is. Old Mandalorian records. Jedi records from before the Ruzan reformations. His eyes stayed level. Revan. Mace's arms came unfolded. Across the chamber, two masters who had been maintaining careful stillness stopped maintaining it. That's not possible, Ki-Adi-Mundi said quietly. Revan lived 4,000 years ago. Multiple stasis intervals spanning the full gap, Revan said. The most recent, 340 years. The math is not the relevant problem. They argued for 2 hours. Not about whether to believe him. Yoda had settled that with a single statement, and whatever authority Yoda chose to deploy in this chamber, it deployed absolutely. They argued about what to do with the information. Mace wanted a coordinated strike on the Chancellor's offices with Senate verification first. A master named Stas Ali wanted to bring the Senate Military Oversight Committee into the conversation. Someone suggested waiting for more evidence, and Revan let that suggestion reach its natural end without interrupting it, because it was going to reach that end regardless. The man you're describing, Mace said finally, is the Supreme Chancellor of the Republic. The political and legal mechanism for removing him from power requires a Senate vote that he controls. You're telling us the only solution is extrajudicial. I'm telling you the solution is accurate, Revan said. What it's called is a secondary concern. The silence that followed was the kind that meant the room understood the argument and didn't like it, which was different from the room disagreeing with it. Yoda turned his chair slightly, looking toward the Transparistile and the city beyond. Show us proof, can you? Not yet, Revan said. I need one thing first. What thing? Mace asked. Access to Anakin Skywalker. The temperature of the room changed. Mace's eyes narrowed by a fraction. The motion was controlled, but it happened. Why? Because the Sith have been grooming him for years, Revan said, and he doesn't know it. And because what's been done to him can be undone, but not by you. The room didn't answer that. Yoda's ear moved, a slight rotation, the equivalent in his range of expression of a sharp intake of breath. His eyes came back from the Transparistile and settled on the masked figure in the center of the chamber. Careful, the old master said softly. With him, careful you must be. Seen too many architects of good intention I have. Ruin built with the best materials still stands. I know, Revan said. I've built some of it. No one in the chamber had an answer for that either. Mandalore from orbit looked like an argument. The planet's surface, bone-white desert broken by the silver geometry of domed cities, made a case for order, for control, for civilization imposed on a landscape that had never been hospitable to it. The new Mandalorians had built their enclosed cities precisely because the open world was hostile, and had decided, somewhere in the generational transition from warrior culture to pacifist governance, that the hostility of the world was the problem, rather than something to be met on its own terms. Death Watch had a different opinion. Their camp occupied the northern reach of the Concordia Moon's abandoned mineworks, old durasteel structures half reclaimed by frost and shadow, modified with the practical, ugly efficiency of people who had traded aesthetics for function and considered the trade a point of pride. Sensor arrays bolted to crumbling walls. Guard rotations running on a schedule tight enough to mean someone competent had designed it. Fires burning inside sealed perimeters because the cold on Concordia at night was serious enough to kill the careless. Revan walked through the outer perimeter at 0200 hours without triggering a single alarm. Not stealth. Not jamming. He simply moved through the gaps in their pattern with the ease of someone who had read their rotation once and filed it undersolved. The first guard who actually saw him was a young warrior, no older than 22, sitting at a checkpoint near the inner compound wall. The warrior's hand went to his blaster with commendable speed. Revan stopped walking and stood in the torchlight and let the young man see the mask clearly. The hand stayed on the blaster, didn't draw. "Get your commanding officer," Revan said. The young warrior's mouth opened and didn't produce a sound for a full 3 seconds. Then, he was moving. Pre Vizsla was not a man who impressed easily. He had fought Republic commandos, Jedi Knights, Death Watch defectors, and a Separatist liaison who had made the catastrophic error of treating him like an employee rather than an ally. He had won most of those engagements and learned something useful from the ones he hadn't. He understood leverage, and he understood violence, and he understood the specific politics of a warrior culture where every act of deference had a cost that compounded. He came to the checkpoint with 12 of his best at his back because he was not reckless, and he saw the masked figure standing in the torchlight, and the mask's design stopped him 6 paces short of where he'd intended to stop. "Who are you?" Vizsla demanded. "You already know," Revan said. "I want to hear you say it." Revan was quiet for a moment. Then, "My name has been in your oral histories for 4,000 years. The man who broke Mandalore the Ultimate in single combat. The man your ancestors followed into war against the Sith because he was the only commander in the galaxy who asked them to do something worthy of them. A beat. I've been away. I'm back." Vizsla studied him. His eyes moved across the mask, the robes, the 2 lightsabers, with the assessment of a man cataloging threat rather than theater. "Prove it," Vizsla said. "Your best fighter," Revan said. "Pick them yourself. I'll wait." The fighter's name, Revan was told, was Brian, a woman who stood 2 meters tall in her Beskar and had won the Concordia Proving Grounds 3 years running. Vizsla's people made a space in the compound's central yard without being asked to, the way people make space when something is about to happen that they understand intuitively will be worth seeing. Brian came at him without ceremony. She was fast, genuinely fast, the kind of speed that came from a lifetime of discipline rather than youth, her footwork precise, her first strike a testing blow aimed at his right shoulder with enough force to crack bone through light armor if it landed clean. Revan stepped inside it. Not back. Not to the side. Inside, deflecting her forearm with his left hand at the moment of extension. Not blocking the force of it. Redirecting it. Using her own committed weight to pull her 2 degrees off center. His right hand found her wrist as she corrected. He held it. She drove her left elbow toward his jaw. He was already below it. He took her down in 4 seconds. Not a throw. A controlled descent. 1 knee on the ground. Both wrists pinned. The full weight of the engagement over before the watching crowd had fully processed that it had begun. He released her immediately and stepped back. She was on her feet in another second, breathing harder than she would have wanted. She looked at him. Then she took a step back and stood straight, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The statement had been made in a language she understood better than basic. The watching crowd was very still. An older man pushed through from the back of the gathered warriors. He was in his 60s, scarred in the specific way of a man who had stopped trying to avoid damage and started simply surviving it, wearing armor that had been repaired so many times in so many different ways that it told a biography. He moved past Vizsla's lieutenants without looking at them, and stopped 5 paces from Revan and stared at the mask for a long time. "Katika told this story," the old man said. His voice was low, not reverent. Mandalorians didn't do reverence exactly, but waited. His father told it to him. His father's father told it to that man. 4,000 years and the mask never changed in the telling. He paused. "You beat Mandalore the Ultimate with your bare hands. It took longer than this," Revan said. The old man almost smiled. What do you want with us? The same thing I wanted before, Revan said. I want you in a fight that's worth your time. Vizsla let him speak. That itself was a concession, whether Vizsla intended it as one or not. Revan stood in the compound's main hall, a structure that had been a mining operations center and still looked like one, stripped to function. Illuminated by industrial lighting that cast everything in flat white, and laid out the shape of the war as it actually existed, not as the HoloNet framed it. He named Dooku. He named Sidious. He described what a 1,000-year Sith plan to manufacture a galactic war looked like from the outside, and what it would look like in 10 years if no one removed the engine driving it. He did not appeal to their patriotism. He did not use the word democracy. He told them a war was being run in the dark by someone who had decided the galaxy's warrior cultures were a resource to be consumed and discarded, and that he was going to that war, and they could come or they could stay on their frozen moon. The compound was quiet when he finished. Then a voice from the back. What's your third faction actually have to offer? Numbers? Mandalorian numbers, Revan said. Republic defectors. And a commander who has run campaigns you haven't seen the scale of. He paused. Also, I know where Dooku operates from. That landed differently than the rest of it. He'd intended it to. Vizsla stepped forward. His jaw was set in the expression of a man who had already made a decision and was now performing the deliberation for the benefit of his subordinates. Say we come. Say we follow you. What does that make us? It makes you the faction that ended a manufactured war before it consumed another decade and another generation, Revan said. What you call that is your business. The old man with the biographic armor spoke without being addressed. He fights the way the old stories say. I was at the checkpoint. He looked at Vizsla. The old code doesn't say anything about whether the man who earns the right is human or Jedi or dead for 4,000 years. It says he earns it, or he doesn't. Vizsla was quiet for a long moment. Around him, the warriors of Deathwatch stood in the flat white light and waited for him to finish thinking. We have conditions, Vizsla said finally. Name them tomorrow, Revan replied. I need to sleep. The old man laughed, short, surprised, genuine. 2 or 3 others followed. The tension in the hall didn't disappear, but it changed character, became something less combustible, something that had room in it for what came next. Vizsla looked at Revan for another long moment, then nodded once. It was not submission. It was the beginning of a negotiation between people who had established, at least, that they were speaking the same language. Revan accepted it for what it was and asked someone to show him where the heat was. The Ryloth system at war looked like a wound that wouldn't close. Separatist occupation had left the planet's surface scarred in ways that went deeper than the bombing craters visible from orbit. Supply lines strangled, villages emptied, the Twi'lek population redistributed according to Techno-Union logistics rather than anything resembling human consideration. The Republic had been trying to break the blockade for weeks. The campaign stalled longer than it should have been. The corridor strategy absorbing losses that the Separatist fleet replaced with mechanical indifference. Naval engagements that cost ships and pilots and achieved incremental gains that the opposing formation absorbed and adjusted for with the patience of a command structure that didn't mourn its losses because its losses didn't have families. From the bridge of a Mandalorian assault carrier running under a false transponder, Revan watched the engagement on the tactical display and counted the Republic's mistakes. There were several. The cruiser formation was treating the blockade as a static problem. Punch through the center, establish a corridor, reinforce the corridor. Clean, logical, the kind of strategy that worked against an opponent who thought in the same doctrinal language. The Separatist fleet was not thinking in that language. It was thinking in weight. More ships, more droids, more replaceable tonnage, and the Republic's elegant corridor strategy was being absorbed and compressed the way a fist compresses when it punches water. They're going to lose that left flank in 11 minutes, said Fen. The younger of Vizsla's lieutenants who had been assigned to Revan's ship as a liaison and had spent most of the transit from Concordia trying to decide whether to be suspicious or impressed. He'd been settling, gradually, on a third option that didn't have a clean name. 9, Revan said. It was 9. The comm request to the Republic flagship took 4 minutes to be accepted. which meant someone on the other end was deciding whether to accept it at all, which meant there was a commander on that bridge capable of caution. The face that appeared on screen was young for the rank it carried, a Jedi Knight in his late 20s, dark-haired, the particular expression of a man managing 3 simultaneous problems while pretending to manage one. Anakin Skywalker looked at the masked figure on his comm screen, and his hand moved instinctively toward his saber before it stopped. "Who are you?" Anakin said. "The reason your left flank just held," Revan said. 3 Mandalorian gunships had repositioned 30 seconds ago on his silent order, shoring the gap before the Separatist probe could exploit it. On Anakin's tactical display, the correction would have appeared as an anomaly, support from an unregistered vessel that hadn't been there a moment before. "You have a larger problem than the blockade. I need 20 minutes of your time when this is over." Anakin studied the mask. His presence in the Force was extraordinary. Revan had felt it from across the engagement zone. A brightness that the surrounding chaos couldn't dim, and underneath the brightness something compressed and pressurized that the Jedi Order had clearly decided to manage rather than address. A decision that was going to have consequences they hadn't finished calculating yet. "You're not Republic," Anakin said. "No, not Separatist. No." A beat. On the tactical display behind Anakin, a Separatist destroyer was rotating to bring its port cannons to bear on the Second Republic cruiser. "Your destroyer," Revan said. "Port side." Now, Anakin turned, saw it, and started issuing orders in the same motion. He did not ask how Revan had noticed before his own sensors flagged it. The battle took 40 minutes from that point. Revan did not take command. He offered, through Fenn's comm relay, precise incremental corrections, a repositioning here, a feint there, a suggestion to pull the third cruiser back 2 clicks and use it as bait for the Separatist carrier that was clearly being held in reserve for a decisive moment that Revan intended to make decisive in the wrong direction. The corrections worked because they were accurate, not because anyone on the Republic side had decided to trust an unregistered masked stranger. They worked because Anakin Skywalker was smart enough to try a suggestion when it was specific, and discard it when it wasn't. And every suggestion Revan offered was specific. The Separatist carrier came out of reserve exactly when Revan said it would. What it found, instead of the vulnerable cruiser it had been maneuvered toward, was a Mandalorian assault carrier that had been running dark behind a debris field for the last 20 minutes, flanked by 6 gunships that opened fire in a coordinated pattern before the carrier's captain had finished processing that the tactical situation was not what it had been a moment ago. The carrier was disabled in 4 minutes. Not destroyed, disabled. Engines killed. Weapons offline, crew alive. Revan had specified disabled. With the carrier gone, the Separatist fleet's formation lost its anchor. The ships at the edges began pulling back to defensive positions, and defensive positions in a blockade engagement meant the blockade was already over. You don't defend a blockade. You enforce it. And a fleet in defensive posture has conceded the enforcement question. Fenn watched the formation collapse on the display. He said nothing for a moment. "You knew they'd hold the carrier back," he said finally. "I knew what I would do with a carrier in that position," Revan said. "People who plan battles tend to plan them the way they think." What no one on the Republic side saw was the other half of the engagement. On Ryloth's surface, the Separatist ground forces had received the battle's opening phase as a signal to tighten their hold on the occupied territories. Standard doctrine, make yourself expensive to remove before the blockade breaks. 3 armored columns had begun moving toward the largest civilian settlement in the northern continent. Revan had anticipated this. He closed his eyes on the bridge of the assault carrier and breathed and let the force extend outward and downward through the engagement space, past the capital ships, past the atmosphere, into the ground engagement on the planet below. Battle meditation was not a technique that announced itself. It didn't feel, from the outside, like anything at all, not to the people it affected, not to the commanders watching their tactical displays. What it felt like, from the inside of the droid command network, was nothing, because droids didn't feel. What it produced, in the behavior of those droids, was a subtle and compounding degradation of coordination, fire teams that didn't quite synchronize, column commanders whose targeting data lagged by fractions of seconds, flanking maneuvers that arrived at the right location at the wrong moment. Nothing dramatic. Nothing a field commander watching from above could point to and name. Just a slow erosion of the precise timing that made a droid army dangerous. On the Republic side, the inverse. The clone troopers holding defensive positions in the settlement's outer ring found themselves moving with a clarity they couldn't account for. The right cover, the right moment, the right angle presenting itself just ahead of need. 3 men who would have been in a crossfire weren't. A sergeant who had been pinned for 11 minutes found a gap and took it. Revan held the meditation for 16 minutes. His hands gripped the edge of the tactical console. The concentration required was physical. Not muscular, but the kind of exhaustion that came from maintaining a vast and delicate structure of attention without letting any part of it collapse. His awareness had to hold the surface engagement and the orbital engagement simultaneously, 2 different scales of violence running at different speeds, and find the adjustments that served both without pulling him entirely into either. A BX series droid commando came through the assault carrier's port airlock. It had been aboard since Concordia, hiding in the lower maintenance crawlway, running on low power to avoid sensor sweeps. It moved toward the bridge with the silent efficiency of something that had been waiting for the moment its target was stationary and occupied. Revan's eyes stayed closed. His left hand came off the console and caught the commando's forearm at full extension, stopping the vibroblade it was carrying 8 centimeters from his neck. He held the arm, applied precise leverage, and the commando's weapon clattered to the deck. He released the meditation for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to push the commando into the bulkhead with enough force to bend the durasteel, and then returned to it. Fenn stared at him. "Secondary sweep," Revan said, his eyes still closed. "Before we reach any engagement. Tell Vizsla." Fenn looked at the crumpled commando and the dented bulkhead. He opened his comm. The Republic flagship's shuttle bay received 1 visitor at 1400 hours. Anakin Skywalker was waiting at the bottom of the ramp when Revan descended. He had his arms folded in the way of a man who wasn't sure what posture was correct for an encounter he had no category for. He studied the mask, the movement, the 2 lightsabers, and the force presence behind all of it, and something in his expression settled into a kind of recognition that surprised him. "You've been in a war before," Anakin said. "Not a question." "Several," Revan said. Anakin nodded slowly. "The Jedi Council told me to meet you. They didn't tell me what to make of you." "That's honest of them." A short silence. On the deck above, the sounds of damage control crews and post-engagement logistics filled the bay with the ordinary noise of a warship catching its breath. "You said you had 20 minutes worth of things to tell me," Anakin said. "We've got longer than that." "I know," Revan said. "The 20 minutes was for the part you'll find easy to hear." Anakin held his gaze for a moment through the mask. Then he turned and led the way deeper into the ship, and Revan followed, and the conversation that would take considerably longer than 20 minutes began. The officers' mess on the Resolute at 0300 hours was the closest thing the ship had to quiet. The main lights ran at 30% overnight. A ship-wide protocol that the crew had long since stopped noticing, the way people stop noticing any condition that becomes permanent. The tables were empty. The food dispensers ran their maintenance cycle in the corner, a low mechanical hum that was almost meditative if you weren't listening for it. Outside the viewport, Ryloth turned slowly beneath them, its surface still marked by the fires that hadn't been put out yet. Anakin sat across from Revan with a cup of caf he hadn't touched, and the expression of a man who had been listening for 2 hours and was still deciding what to do with what he'd heard. Revan had told him about Sidious. Not everything. The shape of it. The mechanism. The specific ways a Sith Lord embedded inside a democratic government would consolidate power, and what those consolidations would look like from the inside to someone who trusted the consolidator. He had been precise, and he had been calm, and he had cited specifics rather than assertions, because Anakin Skywalker did not respond well to assertions. He responded to evidence arranged in a logical sequence, and then left alone to reach its own conclusion, which was not a quality the Jedi Council had ever fully learned to use. "Palpatine," Anakin said. He said it the way you say a word that has just changed meaning. Not loudly, just with the full weight of reconsidering everything the word had previously attached to. "Yes," Revan said. "You're certain." I spent 6 hours in a Coruscant data den, reading 30 years of Senate voting records, emergency power authorizations, and military appropriations. Revan's voice was level. The pattern is not subtle once you know what you're looking for. It's only subtle if you trust the man at the center of it. Anakin looked at his calf. The surface of it had gone still. He's been my... He stopped. Started again. Since I was 9. He was the first person who talked to me like I was worth talking to. Revan said nothing. He understood the architecture of that sentence exactly, which was why he didn't try to dismantle it with an argument. Some things needed to be said into air and given a moment before anything else was added to them. That's what made him useful to you, Revan said finally. And what made you useful to him? That's not an accident. That relationship was constructed. The word constructed sat on the table between them like something with weight. The Order told me not to attach, Anakin said. His voice had shifted, not harder, but more internal, the way voices go when they're reaching for something the speaker hasn't entirely examined before. They've been telling me that since I was 9. Don't attach to your mother. Don't attach to Padme. Don't attach to anything. Because attachment leads to... He stopped. They never told me what to do with it instead. They told me what not to do. That was the whole lesson. Revan was quiet for a moment. The Jedi are not wrong about the danger, he said. They're wrong about the remedy. Suppression isn't discipline. It's a pressure vessel. The contents don't disappear. They compress, and compressed things find exits. He paused. I fell to the dark side. Completely. Not by accident, and not because someone tricked me into it, although someone did try. I fell because I believed I was the only person with the clarity to see what needed to be done, and the will to do it. And I let that belief make me into something I would not have chosen to become. The love I had for people became the justification for the harm I did to people. That's the actual mechanism. Not attachment. The conviction that attachment gives you the right to override everyone else's choice about their own life. Anakin was very still. Padme, Revan said. You're terrified of losing her. It wasn't a question, and Anakin didn't treat it like one. He looked at the viewport. I have dreams. I know. The Council knows too, and they're handling it the way they handle everything they don't have a doctrine for. Which is to say, they're hoping if they don't address it directly, it will resolve itself. Revan's voice carried no particular judgment on this. It was a statement of fact. It won't. So what do I do with it? Anakin asked. The question was quiet and genuine, not rhetorical, not defensive. The real question underneath the years of misdirected ones. I can't just stop. I've tried. You're not supposed to stop, Revan said. You're supposed to hold it differently. Fear of loss wants to grip. Gripping is what breaks things. He paused. Love that becomes control isn't love anymore. It's fear wearing love's face. The practice, the actual daily discipline, is learning to tell the difference between the two from the inside, in real time, when the fear is loudest. He let that settle. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's possible. I'm saying I know it's possible because I failed at it completely, and then spent several lifetimes learning how to do it correctly. And I'm sitting in front of you now, which means the falling isn't the end of the question. Anakin looked at him for a long moment. You fell and came back. Yes, the Jedi say that isn't possible. Once you've fallen, the Jedi are describing their experience of the people they've seen fall, Revan said. That's not the same as a law of nature. The dark side is not a room you enter and the door locks behind you. It's a direction you move in. Directions can be changed. The calf had gone cold. Anakin turned the cup in his hands without drinking from it. A slow rotation. Something to do with his hands while his mind worked. Revan recognized the gesture. The hands that need movement so the mind can be still. The 501st, Anakin said. Yes, you want me to bring them out of the Republic command structure. I want you to consider what you owe the Republic command structure versus what you owe the men in your legion, Revan said. And then I want you to make a decision based on the answer to that question, not on what you're supposed to do according to a hierarchy that's being run by the man we just discussed. Anakin's jaw tightened slightly. Asking me to go against the chain of command. I'm asking you to recognize that the chain of command has been compromised at its top, Revan said. That's not insubordination. That's accurate assessment. A silence. Anakin set the cup down. There's something else, Revan said. About the men themselves. He paused, and when he continued his voice was measured in the way of someone delivering information they know will land badly, and have decided to deliver clearly regardless. The clone troopers have inhibitor chips implanted in their brains. Biological compliance mechanisms, installed at the embryonic stage, keyed to a specific command signal. When that signal is given, the clones will execute any order, regardless of personal loyalty, personal history, or individual conscience. Anakin was very still. They don't know, Revan said. Your men don't know. They believe their loyalty is their own. It is, right up until the moment someone decides it shouldn't be. The viewport held Ryloth turning and turning in the dark. Below, Anakin's men were on the surface. Some of them were probably still running the tail end of the ground engagement, or sleeping in forward positions, or eating whatever field rations the supply lines had managed to deliver today. Men who had fought beside him for 3 years and called him general, and meant it. How do you remove them? Anakin's voice was very quiet. Carefully, Revan said. I can provide the technical specifications. There are force techniques for locating biological implants precisely, and your medical droids can do the extraction once they know what they're looking for. It needs to be done quietly, in batches, before anyone in the Chancellor's office notices an anomaly in clone compliance data. Anakin nodded once. Slowly, the nod of a man who has moved from hearing something to carrying it. I'll need time, he said. Take it, Revan said. Do it right. Another silence. Different in quality from the ones before, not the silence of resistance or processing, but the silence of a decision settling into place. What are you? Anakin asked, not hostile. Genuinely curious, the question underneath the question being, what category do I put this in? Someone who made every mistake you're being set up to make, Revan said, and survived them all, and came back to be useful if I could. A pause. That's the honest version. I don't have a cleaner one. Anakin looked at him for a long moment across the cold caf and the quiet mess hall and the 3 years of war that had built up behind his eyes. Okay, he said. It was a small word for the size of the thing it was agreeing to. Revan accepted it for exactly what it was. Separatist headquarters on Raxus Secundus occupied the upper third of a building that had been designed to impress. The architecture was deliberate, sweeping cantilevers over a city that genuinely believed it was the rightful capital of a better government, all clean lines and warm light, and the aesthetic language of legitimate authority. Count Dooku had an office at the apex of the structure, with floor-to-ceiling transparent steel on 3 sides. And from it you could see the Senate district of Raxus in every direction, the lights of a civilization that had decided the Republic was broken, and built something in its image as proof that it didn't have to be. The irony was not lost on Dooku. It had simply stopped mattering. He stood at the transparent steel with his hands clasped behind his back and watched the city, and felt. In the Force, the thing that had been troubling him for 11 days without resolving into anything he could name precisely. A disturbance was too vague. An anomaly was too clinical. What he felt was more like pressure, the specific pressure of a situation developing faster than his intelligence network was reporting, which meant his intelligence network had a gap he hadn't identified yet. Dooku did not tolerate unidentified gaps. The Ryloth engagement, he said. The BX series command droid behind him responded immediately. Separatist blockade broken. Carrier implacable disabled rather than destroyed. Analysis of engagement patterns suggests a third-party tactical element operating in support of Republic forces. Vessel registration does not match any known fleet. Third party, Dooku said. Confirmed. Mandalorian configuration, unregistered. Tactical interventions suggest command-level strategic awareness significantly beyond standard Republic doctrine. Dooku was quiet for a moment. The city lights moved below him, indifferent. Get me Grievous, he said. General Grievous appeared on the holoprojector at his usual scale, slightly larger than life. which Dooku had always suspected was a deliberate choice on Grievous's part rather than a technical calibration issue. The Ryloth failure, Grievous said immediately, in the tone of a man who has already decided the failure belongs to someone else, is a symptom, Dooku said, not the problem. There is a third faction operating in this war, General. They assisted the Republic at Ryloth, and they are not Republic. I want to know who they are and where they're operating from before they do anything else. Grievous's optical sensors cycled. My forces will be given specific intelligence when I have specific intelligence to give, Dooku said. Until then, I need you to do something unusual for you. A pause. What? Wait, Dooku said, quietly, without engaging anything until I understand what we're dealing with. The silence from Grievous's end had the particular quality of a very dangerous thing being asked to hold very still, which was not a quality that dangerous thing had been designed for. There are Jedi on Felucia, Grievous said. There will be Jedi on Felucia next week as well, Dooku replied. Let them wait. His master's call came at midnight. Dooku accepted it in the office's inner chamber, where the transparent steel gave way to solid walls and the comfortable fiction of privacy. The hologram of Darth Sidious materialized at its usual height. Small, deliberate, the purple light of the projector making the deep lines of his face into something that belonged in a much older century. You feel it, Sidious said. Not a question. 11 days, Dooku confirmed. I cannot place the source. The Force signature is, he paused, selecting the word with the care of a man who understood that imprecision in this conversation would be noted. Archaic, as though something very old has reactivated. Sidious was still for a moment in the way he was still when he was thinking, rather than performing stillness. His eyes moved to something beyond the frame of the projection. I have felt it also, Sidious said. The fact that his master had not raised this in 11 days was itself information. Dooku filed it without reacting to it. The Mandalorian element at Ryloth, Sidious continued. A third faction with Mandalorian assets suggests a unifying commander with specific historical claim over Mandalorian allegiance. He paused. There have been 3 such figures in recorded history. 2 are confirmed dead. The third, another pause, longer this time. The third was never confirmed. Dooku waited. Take precautions, Sidious said. Reinforce your personal guard. Do not engage this faction directly until I have assessed the situation personally. His eyes came back to center. And Dooku, do not underestimate what may be coming. If I am correct about the source of this disturbance, you will face something your training has not fully prepared you for. In 13 years of service, Darth Sidious had never said that to him. Dooku stood in the dark of his inner chamber after the projection cut out and felt the thing he almost never let himself feel, because it was unproductive, and he was a man who had spent his entire adult life excising the unproductive from his interior landscape. He felt it anyway. They came on the 3rd day after that. Not a fleet, not a frontal assault. A single shuttle, Mandalorian in configuration, broadcasting a negotiation signal on the Separatist diplomatic frequency. A frequency that technically still existed from the days when the Republic and the nascent Separatist movement had still been talking to each other, before the talking stopped and the shooting started. The signal contained a message. The message was 7 words. We should speak before this gets worse. Dooku read it 3 times. Then he opened a channel to his personal guard, doubled the security rotation, and sent a single-word reply. Come, the shuttle landed on the private platform at the building's apex. Dooku was at the platform's edge when the ramp descended. He had his hands clasped behind his back again. The posture he defaulted to when he wanted to project composure without advertising that the composure was effortful. 2 of his elite organic guardsmen flanked him at parade distance. 12 Mandalorian warriors came down the ramp first and took positions along the platform perimeter without being directed to, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who had trained under a specific and demanding standard. Then the masked figure descended. Dooku had been educated in Jedi archives that contained records most masters were not cleared to access. He had studied Sith holocrons that documented the ancient wars, the great campaigns. The commanders who had shaped galactic history before the current era made everyone complacent about how large history could get. He had read descriptions. He had seen fragmentary holo-recordings, degraded, incomplete, the resolution of ancient technology doing poor justice to the subject. He recognized the mask anyway. The recognition moved through him like cold water. His hands, clasped behind his back, tightened slightly against each other. His face did not change. "Count Dooku," the masked figure said. "You have me at a disadvantage," Dooku said. The words were automatic, the social reflex of a man buying time while his mind caught up to the situation. "You know my name." "I know considerably more than your name," Revan said. "You were a Jedi Master, one of the finest of your generation by most accounts. You left the Order because you saw clearly that its institutional rot was accelerating toward a collapse it couldn't prevent, and you were not wrong about that diagnosis. The treatment you chose, however, was prescribed by the person who manufactured the disease." Dooku was quiet. "Darth Sidious engineered the Republic's decay," Revan continued. "He cultivated the corruption you found so intolerable, specifically because he needed men of your quality and your disillusionment to build the opposition he required. You are not his apprentice. You are his most expensive instrument." The city spread in every direction below them. The warm lights of Raxus, civilization performing itself. "You speak with considerable confidence," Dooku said, "for someone making claims you cannot substantiate." "Maul," Revan said. "Dathomirian, trained before you. Discarded when he became inconvenient. Ask yourself what differentiates his utility from yours, and whether that difference is permanent." The guardsmen registered nothing. They were not built for the kind of threat this conversation represented. Dooku looked at the masked figure across the platform and felt his mind moving with the specific quality of motion it achieved when he was solving a problem that mattered. Every piece Revan had named was a piece Dooku had held for years, in a separate compartment from every other piece. The architecture of what they formed when arranged together was not something he had allowed himself to construct before. He constructed it now. It took perhaps 4 seconds. "What do you want?" Dooku asked. "The same thing you want," Revan said. "An end to this war. The actual end, not the managed conclusion your master has planned, which ends with him in command of everything and you as a footnote." He paused. "I want Sidious. You're going to help me get him." The wind off the Raxus plains moved across the platform. Dooku looked at the city he'd helped build as proof of a better idea, and at the masked figure who had just dismantled 11 days of unnamed pressure into something he could see clearly, and at the guardsmen who would be useless in the next 30 seconds if this went wrong. "You'd better come inside," Dooku said. The inner office of the Raxus Apex building had the quality of a room that had been arranged by someone who understood that environments make arguments. Dooku's desk was old, genuinely old, not antique as affectation, but a piece of Sereno hardwood that had been in his family for 6 generations. Brought here because he had not fully committed to the fiction that he had left everything behind when he left the Republic. The bookshelves held actual books, physical volumes, some of them older than the desk. The lighting was warm and directional. Everything in the room said, "I am a man of civilization, of history, of taste," and meant it. Which was what made the room honest in a way that Dooku himself rarely was. Revan stood in the center of it and did not look at any of it. "Sidious will know you've spoken to me," Revan said. "Not the content, he can't reach that, but the fact of contact. His intelligence network on Raxus is more extensive than you're aware of. You have 11 informants in this building. 3 of them report to him directly." Dooku poured 2 glasses of something amber from a decanter on the sideboard. He did not offer one. He set them both on the desk and sat, and the motion had the quality of a man performing composure for an audience that wasn't there, because the performance had become indistinguishable from the reality. "You've been in my building for less than 20 minutes, Dooku said. "I've been reading your building security logs for 4 days, Revan said. "The 3rd floor maintenance roster has 2 names that don't correspond to living people. The Eastern Watch rotation has a gap between Eero 200 and Eero 230 that repeats every 6 days, which is too regular to be careless and too specific to be coincidental." He paused. "You have good security. Someone has better." Dooku looked at him. Then, with the deliberateness of a man making a decision in real time, he picked up one of the glasses and drank. "What do you need from me?" he said. Information I can verify independently, Revan said. The location of Sidious's active operations infrastructure, not the Senate office, that's a stage set. The real architecture. Safe houses, communication relays, the chain of command between him and the bioengineering facilities that produced the clone army. Dooku was quiet for a moment. You know about Kamino. I know about the inhibitor chips, Revan said. I know about Order 66. I know the entire war is a mechanism for delivering a galactic empire to one man. And I know you've suspected for at least 2 years that your position in the aftermath of that delivery is less secure than you've been led to believe. He paused. I want to know what you know that I don't. What Dooku knew filled 3 hours. He spoke with the precision of a man who had been keeping exact records in his own memory, because committing them to any external medium was a risk he'd understood from the beginning. Locations, dates, the names of senators whose loyalty Sidious had purchased, and the mechanisms of that purchase. The communication protocol between Sidious and the Separatist leadership that bypassed every official channel, the contingency plans, what happened to the Separatist Council when the war reached its planned conclusion, what happened to the Senate, what happened to the Jedi, what happened to Dooku. He said that last part without emphasis, which was the most revealing thing about the way he said it. Revan listened without interrupting. He asked 3 clarifying questions across the entire 3 hours, each one specific enough that Dooku understood the information he was receiving was being integrated into a structure already substantially built. When it was over, Dooku sat back and looked at the amber glass he'd been holding for an hour without finishing. You're going to ask me to turn on him, Dooku said. I'm going to ask you to be in a specific location at a specific time and not warn him we're coming, Revan said. That's the extent of what I need from you. And in return, you live, Revan said. You stand trial. Republic custody, not Mandalorian. The charges are substantial and the consequences will be serious, but they will be legal consequences, administered by a functioning justice system once the man who corrupted the existing one is removed. He paused. That's more than you'll get from Sidious when he decides you've reached the end of your usefulness, which, based on what you've just told me, is approximately 4 months away. Dooku set the glass down. You're not going to argue that I deserve better than a trial, he said. It was almost a question. No, Revan said. You don't. Something in Dooku's expression shifted. Not relief, not quite, but the specific change in a face that has been holding an argument against itself for a long time and has just been given permission to stop. The attack came at the 3rd hour's end. Not unexpected. Revan had placed 2 Mandalorian warriors on the building's external sensor grid before entering, and they had been transmitting a clean feed for the duration of the meeting. What came wasn't subtle enough to avoid that feed. A squad of BX-series droid commandos, 12 units, descending the exterior of the building on magnetic clamps. Keyed to breach the inner office simultaneously from 3 access points. Not Dooku's order. The timing was too precise for a decision made inside the meeting. Someone else had decided the meeting needed to end. The 3 informants, Revan said. Dooku stood, his saber in his hand before the word was finished. The red blade cast the warm office in a second. Harsher light. He looked at the access points. Door, east window, ventilation above the bookshelf, with the expression of a man calculating angles he'd calculated in rooms like this before and not enjoyed. Together? Or separately? Dooku asked. Separately, Revan said. I want to see your form. The east window blew in. 3 droid commandos through the window, high-quality units, vibroblade models, moving in a coordinated spread that was designed to create overlapping threat vectors and deny a single opponent the space to address them sequentially. Dooku addressed them sequentially anyway. His Makashi was exactly what the Jedi archives described. Precise, aristocratic, the absolute minimum of motion required for the maximum result. No flourish. No wasted commitment. He moved between the 3 strikes with the unhurried elegance of a man who had decided years ago that he would not be hurried by anything, and each parry became a redirect, each redirect a position, each position a clean line to an opponent's primary joint. The first commando lost its right arm at the shoulder socket. The second took a thrust through its optical processing unit. The third managed to drag its blade across Dooku's left forearm before it ceased to function. 6 seconds. 3 units. Dooku stood in the wreckage of his east window with the burn from the vibroblade contact visible on his wrist, and said nothing. The door and the ventilation gave up their commandos simultaneously. Revan moved. He did not ignite a saber immediately, which was the first thing that would have confused anyone trained in the Jedi combat tradition, the assumption being that a Force user in close quarters reaches for a blade first. He didn't. He reached into the formation coming through the door and seized the lead unit with telekinesis, swung it into the 2 behind it, with enough force to collapse all 3 against the far wall in a tangle of disrupted gyroscopes, and only then ignited the purple blade for the 2 that had separated from the collision. The 2 from the ventilation were the interesting problem. They had come down from above and achieved a positional advantage, high ground, blade reach extended by the angle, and moved to exploit it with the competent aggression of units that had been programmed by someone who understood leverage. He switched. The purple blade went to his left hand and the red ignited in his right, and his combat posture changed so completely in the space of a single movement that the 2 commandos' targeting systems had to run a reacquisition cycle, not long, a fraction of a second. But a fraction of a second was an enormous quantity of time to spend recalibrating when your opponent had already closed half the distance. The Juyo variant aggression of the red blade drove the first unit's defenses backward. The cold geometric precision of the purple finished it. The second unit attempted to break contact and reset, a tactically sound decision, and too late. 12 droid commandos. 40 seconds. The office was a ruin. 2 windows gone, half the bookshelf torn from the wall, the hardwood desk displaced 2 meters from its original position by the telekinetic impact of the door group. One of the actual books had landed, open, in the center of the floor. Dooku looked at the room, then at Revan. "You switch between forms mid-engagement," he said. "Yes, I've never seen that." It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was an assessment delivered by a man who had spent 60 years believing he had seen every meaningful variation of lightsaber combat, encountering evidence to the contrary. "Your Makashi is exceptional," Revan said. "It will not be enough against Sidious." Dooku's jaw tightened. "I'm aware." "Which means you need to not fight him," Revan said. "When we move on Coruscant, your role is intelligence and access, not combat. I need you functional, not demonstrated." A pause. Dooku looked at the destroyed office with the expression of a man saying goodbye to something, though exactly what was difficult to specify. "The Separatist Council," he said. "When this ends, when Sidious falls, the Confederacy collapses without its hidden engine. The member systems will need a transition framework or the power vacuum becomes its own catastrophe. Write it up," Revan said. "You have 4 days." Dooku looked at him. Something moved across his face, complex, not easily named, the expression of a man who has spent decades being used for someone else's purpose being given, for the first time in a very long time. Something that resembled an actual task. 4 days, Dooku said. He set his saber on the displaced desk, picked up the book from the floor, looked at its open page, and closed it carefully. The strike force assembled on Coruscant's level 13-3 at 0400 hours, in a loading bay that had last been used for something legitimate, approximately never. 40 Mandalorian warriors in full Beskar, weapons checked and rechecked in the particular silence of people who do not need to be told to be thorough. 16 clones from the 501st, not all of them, not yet, but the 16 whose inhibitor chips Anakin had confirmed removed. Men who had sat in a medbay on the Resolute 3 weeks ago, while a surgical droid worked with force, guided precision through a procedure that had no official name and no entry in any Republic medical database. They stood apart from the Mandalorians with the specific self-containment of soldiers who have recently learned something about themselves that required a period of private reckoning. Rex stood at the front of the clone contingent. He had said, when Anakin told him about the chips, exactly 4 words: "Every man." All of them. Then he had organized the extraction schedule himself, and not spoken about it again. Anakin stood beside Revan at the bay's edge, looking at the assembled force with the expression of a man who has crossed a line he can see clearly behind him and has decided not to look at it anymore. A trial requires a room full of people who still believe the lie, Revan said. I have run out of patience for rooms. The council knows we're moving? Anakin asked. Windu knows. He's handling the Senate notification simultaneously, the legal framework for removing a chancellor under emergency corruption statutes. That gives us 30 minutes before Palpatine's office receives any official communication. Revan paused. We will be inside the building in 20. Anakin nodded. His hand rested on his saber without gripping it, a distinction that would have meant nothing to anyone not trained to read it, and meant everything to anyone who was. The clones on Coruscant, he said. The ones we haven't reached yet. We'll receive the Order 66 signal the moment Palpatine identifies the threat, Revan said. And will not execute it, because the signal requires a functional inhibitor chip to translate into action, and a non-functional chip receives the signal as noise. He looked at Rex. Your men know what to expect from the Coruscant Guard. Rex's answer was immediate. They'll handle it. The Republic Executive Building's lower security perimeter fell in 4 minutes. Not because it was poorly designed, it wasn't. It was the best security architecture Republic credits could commission, with overlapping sensor fields and a guard rotation that had been tightened 3 times since the war began. It fell because Dooku had provided the access codes for the maintenance infrastructure, and because Mandalorians in full Beskar moving through a maintenance corridor in darkness at 0415 are a problem that security architecture designed for lone infiltrators is not scaled to address. The Coruscant Guard response came at the second perimeter. They came in force, Senate security, red-armored and disciplined, not clone troopers but veterans of a different kind of close-quarters training, the kind that came from protecting powerful people in enclosed spaces for years. They came around a corner in a tight formation and found themselves facing 40 Mandalorians, and stopped moving. The formation held for approximately 2 seconds. Then Rex stepped forward from behind the Mandalorian line, removed his helmet and said clearly, "Stand down." The Chancellor is being removed under corruption statutes. Anyone who fires on this force fires on the Republic they were hired to protect. The Guard commander, a human woman, late 40s, the kind of face that had been making rapid assessments under pressure for 20 years, looked at Rex, looked at the Mandalorians, looked at the corridor behind her that led upward toward the Chancellor's chambers. I have standing orders, she said. So do I, Rex said. Mine are newer. She looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then she said, quietly to her formation, weapons down. Nobody moves. It was not a defection. It was a woman deciding that the scope of what she was being asked to die for did not match the scope of what she was willing to die for, and making that calculation cleanly and fast. Rex put his helmet back on. The Order 66 signal went out at 0431. Revan felt it in the Force, not the signal itself, which was an electronic transmission, but the moment of its sending, which carried in it the particular quality of a man using a weapon he had maintained in secret for a decade and believed still to be functional. A wave going out. An expectation attached to it. The expectation returned empty. On 6 levels of the executive building, clone troopers on standard security rotation received the signal. They registered it the way any receiver registers a transmission on a dead frequency. A brief processing query, a null result, system continuity unchanged. They kept walking their rotations. They kept watching their sectors. They did not, in any sense that mattered, receive an order. In a corridor on level 14, a trooper named Hark, 22 years old, Camino bred, 3 years on Coruscant rotation, felt something that was not quite describable in military vocabulary. The closest word he found for it later, talking to Rex in a debrief that no official record would document, was relief. As though something that had been present without his knowledge of its presence had simply ceased to be present, and the cessation felt like a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He kept walking his rotation. The building did not turn on itself. The mechanism that had been built to make it do so had no purchase. Mace Windu's team was in the Senate chamber when the signal went out. He felt it too, felt the sending, felt the return of nothing, and allowed himself exactly 1 second of something that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief, and was perhaps simply the acknowledgement that the thing he had feared most in this operation had not happened. Then he returned to the work of serving the legal documentation to the Senate Security Committee chairman, which was less dramatic than what was happening 17 floors above, but was the architecture that made the dramatic thing legitimate, rather than merely violent. The chairman read the documentation with the expression of a man who had suspected for some time that a morning like this was coming, and had decided, upon its arrival, to process it correctly. He countersigned at 0437. The building assault took 11 minutes from the second perimeter to the floor below Palpatine's inner sanctum. 11 minutes of corridors and checkpoints and one serious engagement on level 19 where the Chancellor's personal Coruscant guard, the inner ring, not the outer, the ones who had been selected specifically for loyalty that went beyond institutional and into personal, made a stand that cost 4 Mandalorians injuries serious enough to pull them from the advance. The Mandalorians noted their fallen and kept moving, because that is what Mandalorians do, and because the 4 who were down were breathing, and breathing meant the accounting could happen later. Anakin moved through the engagement differently from the Mandalorians. He didn't clear rooms the way soldiers clear rooms, sequentially, methodically, one threat at a time. He moved through the forced geography of the building the way a man moves through a place he has visited before, reading the emotional residue of every corridor, the fear ahead, the determination behind, the specific and unmistakable darkness that had been sitting at the top of this structure for 13 years, filling the place the way damp fills old stone. Slowly and completely, until you couldn't identify where it had come from. He had been in this building hundreds of times. He had sat in the office above them, and felt like himself. The knowledge of what that meant, the specific revision required to every memory of warmth, of being seen, of mattering to someone in a position of power, sat in his chest in a way that was not grief exactly, because grief required the thing to have been real, and this had not been real. It was something with no clean name. He moved through it the way Revan had described moving through the dark side, not around it, not suppressing it, through it, holding it without letting it pilot the ship. The door to Palpatine's inner sanctum was reinforced durasteel, 3 inches thick, magnetically sealed from inside. Revan looked at it for a moment. He reached into the Force, found the magnetic seal's electromagnetic center, and pulled it apart at the molecular level, with the particular precision of someone who had breached sealed doors in a dozen different centuries, and found that the underlying physics remained consistent. The seal failed. The door swung. The office beyond was exactly as it had always been. Same desk, same artifacts on the shelves, pieces from a dozen cultures, acquired over a long career of public service and private intention. Same window behind the desk, Coruscant's skyline filling it in the last hour before dawn, the city still running its ordinary life below. 17 trillion people unaware that the architecture of their future was being revised in this room at this moment. Palpatine stood behind the desk. He was not attempting to escape, he was not reaching for a weapon or a comm. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the 2 figures in the doorway. Revan. Masked. Still, Anakin, saber unlit but in hand, and the pleasant mask. The one that had been his primary instrument for 13 years was simply gone. What was underneath it was not a performance. His eyes moved to Anakin first. "My boy," Palpatine said. His voice had dropped an octave and shed everything that had made it warm. What remained was older and colder and enormously, patiently certain of itself. "You have no idea what you've walked away from." Anakin looked at him across the desk and the years, and said nothing. Palpatine's eyes moved to the masked figure. Something moved in his expression, complex, rapid, the processing of a man who had planned for many contingencies and was identifying, for the first time in decades, one he had not. "Well," Darth Sidious said. The word carried everything he intended it to carry: acknowledgement, assessment, and beneath both of those, something that was not quite fear, but was the first cousin of it. The vault found its occupant at last. Darth Sidious moved first, not toward them, sideways, a single step to the left that repositioned him relative to the desk, relative to the window, relative to the 2 figures in the doorway. It was not a combat movement. It was a reading movement, the step of a man taking in angles and distances and options with the automatic precision of someone who had been calculating tactical geometry in social situations for so long, the calculation had become indistinguishable from reflex. His hands were still at his sides. "Skywalker," he said. The warmth was entirely gone, and what replaced it was something more honest, a directness that had never been available to the Chancellor persona, the voice of a man who had stopped needing a mask the moment the mask stopped working. "You understand what you are, what you were always going to be. The prophecy doesn't change because you found a new teacher." Anakin said nothing. "The dark side is not a philosophy," Sidious continued, his eyes still on Anakin, his awareness of Revan's presence in the room broadcasting itself through the careful way he didn't look at Revan. "It is a recognition. That power exists, and sentiment about power is the only thing standing between you and its full use. This, a gesture, taking in the room, the assault, the night, is sentiment, dressed in strategy, but sentiment." "You're stalling," Anakin said. Sidious smiled. It was the worst version of the smile, the one with nothing behind it except the assessment that the person receiving it was an instrument being evaluated for continued utility. "Yes," he said, "I am." The window behind him exploded inward. What came through it was not a person. It was energy, raw, electrical, the kind that doesn't originate in a weapon or a reactor but in the Force itself, drawn up from whatever deep current Sidious had been tapping for 60 years of patient, systematic power accumulation. It came as Force lightning, but on a scale that bore the same relationship to ordinary Force lightning that a star bears to a candle, not a bolt, not a stream. But a sustained environmental output, filling the room, the walls conducting it, the floor conducting it, everything conductive in a space that had just been redefined as a kill zone. Anakin moved left. Revan didn't move. He stood in the center of the discharge and raised one hand, and the lightning hit him. It hit him, and went nowhere. Not blocked. Not the way a lightsaber blocks it, the blade absorbing and dissipating at the point of contact. It hit him, and he took it, the full current, and his hand remained raised, and his posture remained unchanged. And the lightning crawled across his robes and his mask, and the visible skin of his hand and produced, as its total external consequence, a faint luminescence around his palm where the energy was being drawn in rather than repelled. Tudamini's was not a dramatic technique. It did not announce itself. It simply unmade the premise of the attack, the assumption that energy directed at a target would damage the target, and left the attacker standing in the ruins of their own certainty. Sidious held the discharge for 4 seconds. Revan absorbed all 4. The room went dark when it stopped, the ambient lighting killed by the power surge, the window a ragged opening to Coruscant's pre-dawn sky, the city's glow the only illumination remaining. In that light, Sidious's face was visible for a moment, in precise detail. What was on it was not rage. Rage would have been manageable, familiar, the expected response. What was on it was the specific expression of a mind encountering a variable it had not modeled. It lasted approximately 1 second. Then it was gone, replaced by the operational calm of a man who had survived 60 years of dangerous situations by never spending more than 1 second on any emotion that didn't serve the next decision. "Tutaminis," Sidious said. His voice was even. "I haven't encountered that in practice in 30 years. "I know," Revan said. "I felt you probe for it. You probe before you commit. It's a sound instinct. The problem is that probing requires a response interval. And I don't need one." Sidious moved to the window. He did it at Force speed, not the step and reposition of before but a genuine translocation. There and then at the window's edge with Coruscant open behind him, and in his hands his lightsaber ignited. The blade was red in a way that other red blades weren't, deeper, more deliberate. The crystal inside it having been subjected to processes that had taken something functional and made it into a statement. He was fast. Genuinely, extraordinarily fast, the speed of a man who had maintained peak combat conditioning for 60 years through Force, assisted discipline, who had been the most dangerous individual combatant in the galaxy for so long that the ranking had stopped feeling like a claim and started feeling like a fact. He came at Revan with the full commitment of someone who had decided that the gap between them was closable if the speed was sufficient. Revan's purple blade was in his hand before Sidious crossed half the distance. The first exchange lasted 3 seconds and covered 12 feet of floor space, Sidious driving forward with the Sith variant of Juyo, the version stripped of all Form 7's spiritual architecture and left as pure aggressive tempo, a style that killed by creating more simultaneous threats than an opponent could process, and relying on the opponent to make one prioritization error. Against most opponents, the error came. Against most opponents, 3 seconds was enough. Revan prioritized correctly every time. Not because he was faster. He wasn't. Sidious's raw speed was as advertised. He prioritized correctly because he had fought in a war where the opponents were not slower than Sidious, and the processing capability required to survive that had become structural, built into reflex rather than thought. He didn't counter. He redirected and repositioned. Each parry converting Sidious's committed momentum into a new angle, each new angle requiring Sidious to reset rather than advance. The Sith variant of Juyo needed continuous forward pressure to function. Deny it forward purchase and it became expensive, the aggression costing energy without producing result. Sidious reset 4 times in 8 seconds. On the 4th reset, he stopped advancing. The shift happened without announcement. Sidious stopped the Juyo entirely and stood at the window's edge, and his presence in the Force expanded. Not an attack, an establishment, the way a tide establishes rather than strikes, filling the available space and making the space into its medium. He was reaching for Battle Meditation's dark inverse, the technique that had broken Republic fleets across the war, that induced despair and hesitation and the micro-failures of coordination that compounded into catastrophic collapse. Revan felt it building. He had 3 options. Counter with his own battle meditation, which would turn the room into a sustained force contest that could last hours and would leave Anakin as an observer in a fight happening at a frequency he couldn't access. Advance under the building pressure and make the physical engagement the priority, accepting the psychological cost of fighting inside the induction field. Or break the technique at its root, which required a different application of Tudaminis, not against electricity, but against a sustained force construct, a significantly more delicate task. He broke it at the root. The force construct unraveled in the specific way of a load-bearing structure that has had its foundation removed. Not dramatically, not with sound. Just the sudden absence of a thing that had been present a moment before. Sidious's expression tightened for exactly 1 second. Then, Revan spoke. Rage is a tool for men who never learned discipline. His voice was level. Conversational? Almost. You have spent 1,000 years perfecting a scream. He took 1 step forward. I spent a lifetime learning silence. Sidious looked at him across the ruined office. Poetic, he said, but silence doesn't win wars. No, Revan agreed. Preparation does. He stepped aside. Anakin moved. He had been still for the duration, not passive, not frozen, but containing something, the way pressure is contained, waiting for the specific moment that made release the right choice rather than simply an available one. He had watched Revan dismantle Sidious's speed and Sidious's technique and Sidious's force construct, and he had understood that the dismantling was not the point. The dismantling was the preparation. The point was this. His blade was gold-white in the pre-dawn dark, the room's only remaining light source, and he came at Sidious not with rage. The rage was there. Had been there for 13 years of accumulated misdirection, but it was not piloting the ship. He came with the specific clarity of a man who has been given permission to be exactly as capable as he actually is, and has decided to use that permission completely. Sidious met him. For 11 seconds they were evenly matched, which was itself remarkable. Sidious, the most dangerous Sith in a millennium, holding ground against Anakin Skywalker, fighting without fear for the first time in his adult life. 11 seconds of genuine contest, the red blade and the gold-white one finding each other in combinations that would have ended most fights in the first 2. Then, the 11th second ended. Anakin found the opening, A half-second commitment on Sidious's part to a high strike that overextended by the precise margin that 3 weeks of Revan's instruction had taught him to recognize and exploit. And he took it. Clean, decisive, unglamorous in the way that real endings are unglamorous, without the ceremony that the moment seemed to demand and didn't receive. Sidious fell. The red blade went dark. Coruscant's pre-dawn light came through the ruined window and found the room and everything in it, the overturned furniture, the artifacts knocked from their shelves, the two men standing in the wreckage of 1,000-year plan's final morning. Anakin stood over what remained of Darth Sidious and breathed and did not speak. Revan walked to the window and looked at the city below, the ordinary lights of 17 trillion people conducting their ordinary lives in the last minutes before a dawn that would be, without their knowledge, the first morning of a different kind of future. "It's done," he said. The words were small. They were the right size for what they were. Not a proclamation. Not a summary. Just the accurate description of a completed thing, offered to the air and the city and the man standing behind him, who had just ended the longest war in living memory with 11 seconds of unencumbered ability. The city moved below them, unhurried, ordinary, and entirely unaware of what had just been returned to it. 3 weeks later, the Senate voted. Not unanimously. Nothing in the Senate was unanimous, which was either its fatal flaw or its only genuine virtue, depending on who you asked. But the margin was sufficient, and the documentation was overwhelming. And the senators who had been Palpatine's instruments voted against the motion, because that was the only play left to them. And lost. And sat in their seats afterward with the expressions of people calculating how much of what they'd done was visible in the evidence, and how much remained buried. Some of it would stay buried. That was the nature of 13 years of patient corruption. You couldn't excavate all of it, and trying to excavate all of it would collapse the structure you were trying to save. Mace Windu had said this in the emergency session with the bluntness of a man who had decided that the moment required honesty more than diplomacy. And the Senate had received it with the discomfort of people being told an accurate thing they would have preferred to receive as a comfortable one. The war machine stopped within a week. Not because anyone issued a single order, the infrastructure was too distributed for that, but because its hidden engine was gone, and an engine-less machine doesn't run. It coasts, and coasting things stop. Separatist fleets received no new directives from Araxis headquarters that was, as of the Senate vote, a transitional administrative body rather than a military command. Clone units received stand-down orders through legitimate chains of command that were, for the first time in 3 years, actually legitimate. The battles that had been scheduled simply weren't fought, and the ones already in progress ground to their conclusions without reinforcement. And then those too were over. Dooku stood trial 6 weeks after Coruscant. He entered the courtroom with the bearing of a man who had decided that if this was what accountability looked like, he would meet it standing straight. The charges were read for 4 hours. He did not contest them. His testimony, when it came, was specific and detailed, and provided the Senate Investigative Committee with 3 months of follow-on work that dismantled the financial and political architecture Sidious had spent decades constructing. It was, in its way, the most useful thing Dooku had done in 30 years. The Jedi Temple at dawn. 6 weeks after the vote. The council chamber held 7 masters, 5 of the original 12, 2 newly elevated in the reorganization that had become necessary when the scope of the Order's near collapse became impossible to set aside in favor of institutional momentum. The seats that had always been empty during the war were still empty, because the masters who had died in it were not replaceable by appointment. Yoda spoke for 40 minutes without pause, which was unusual. He spoke about the living force and the dogma that had grown around it like calcified tissue around a joint. Still functional, technically, but limiting range of motion in ways that had been accumulating for centuries. He spoke about younglings who had been brought to the temple at ages too young for the separation to be anything but a wound, and about the wound being managed rather than healed, and about the difference between those two things. Mace listened with his hands flat on his knees and the expression of a man hearing a case being made that he had been building in his own mind for years without finishing. Reform, the word is, Yoda said. Uncomfortable, the word is also. Both things true. The vote for the commission, an internal body, not Senate appointed. That would spend the next 2 years examining every doctrine the Order had treated as settled, passed 6-1. The one dissenting vote came from a master who had been in the Order for 60 years, and would need, he said, more time. Yoda told him he had exactly as much time as he needed, and not one day more. Anakin and Padme married on a Tuesday. Not a ceremony, no officiant, no guests, no location chosen for its symbolism. A Tuesday morning in their apartment on Coruscant, Padme in the clothes she'd been wearing when Anakin arrived. Anakin still in the jacket he'd had on since the previous day's debrief, with Rex and the medical team processing the last of the inhibitor chip extractions across the remaining 501st. They said what they said to each other in the kitchen, standing, and that was the marriage, and it was exactly sufficient. Obi-Wan found out 4 days later. His response, after a long moment of looking at Anakin with the expression of a man revising a significant quantity of retrospective interpretation, was, "I suspected for approximately 2 years. And?" Anakin said. "And nothing," Obi-Wan said. "I should have said something 2 years ago." He paused. "I'm saying it now." Congratulations, it was not the conversation it would have been 3 months earlier. Revan's philosophy had not made Anakin simpler. Nothing about Anakin Skywalker was or would ever be simple, but it had given him a different relationship to the things he was carrying. The grief for the years of secrecy was there. The anger at the Order's architecture that had made secrecy necessary was there. He held them as things he carried rather than things that were carrying him, and the difference was not minor. He was learning. Daily, the practice was exactly as difficult as Revan had said it would be, and exactly as possible. Rex stood in a medbay on level 7 of the temple, and watched the last clone trooper from the Coruscant rotation come out of the extraction procedure awake and oriented. The trooper's name was Hark. Rex had read the debrief note, the trooper who had felt something he described as relief when the Order 66 signal went out empty. He'd requested to be present for Hark's procedure personally, without explaining why, and no one had asked him to explain. Hark sat up on the medbay table and looked at his hands for a moment, which was something Rex had noticed several of the men do after the procedure. Not checking for injury. Something else. "How do you feel?" Rex asked. Hark considered the question with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "Like myself," he said. Then, after a pause, "I think I always felt like myself. I just didn't know there was something else in there, too." Rex nodded. He understood this precisely. He didn't say so, because the understanding didn't require saying. "Get some rest," Rex told him. "Debrief is 0900. He walked out of the medbay and stood in the corridor for a moment with his helmet under his arm and the hum of the temple's ventilation system around him, and allowed himself, in the quiet of a corridor with no one in it, the full weight of what the last 6 weeks had been. Not the operations. He could process operations. He had the training for operations. The other thing. The thing that didn't have a name in clone operational vocabulary, the category of experience that was not mission-related and not failure-related and not casualty-related, but was simply the experience of having been given, at 30 years old, the information that you were more your own than you had known. He stood in the corridor for approximately 90 seconds. Then he put his helmet on and went back to work. Revan found Anakin on the temple's eastern platform at dusk. The platform was maintenance access. Not ceremonial, exposed metal, no railing on the north side. The wind off Coruscant's upper levels moving through it with the indifferent force of something that didn't care about the significance of the location. The city spread in every direction, its lights coming on in the early evening one by one, the great ordinary machinery of 17 trillion lives running its ordinary business. Anakin heard him coming and didn't turn. They stood in the wind for a moment without speaking. Below them, the temple's lower levels were lit and active. The Reform Commission's first session had run until after dark, which Revan took as a good sign. Sustained discomfort generally meant genuine work. "You're leaving," Anakin said. "Yes." Anakin turned then. He looked at the mask for a long moment, the T-shaped visor, the ancient Beskar, the ventilation servos along the jaw, and his expression had the quality of a man memorizing something he intends to keep. "What do I do now?" he asked. Revan reached up with both hands and broke the seal on the mask. The servos disengaged. He held it for a moment, looking at it the way he had looked at it in the buried dark of a chamber on Lehan, in the first seconds of a return he had not known was coming. He held it out to Anakin. Anakin took it. His hands closed around the Beskar and he held it carefully. The way you hold something that has survived longer than everything around it, and you understand, holding it, that the survival was not accidental. Exactly what you already know how to do, Revan said. You just don't need my permission anymore. The wind moved through the platform. Coruscant's lights spread outward to every horizon, ordinary and vast and entirely unaware of themselves. Revan stepped back. The Force received him the way it receives everything that has completed its purpose and is ready, not dramatically, not with ceremony, but with the quiet of a door closing in an empty house after everyone has gone. The latch settling into place with a sound too small for the significance of the moment, and exactly right, because of it. Anakin stood on the platform with the mask in his hands and looked out at the city. It was imperfect. It was compromised and complex, and full of people who would make the wrong choices tomorrow because they had made them yesterday and hadn't yet found a reason to stop. It was also, for the first time in a very long time, free to choose. He held the mask and let the wind move and didn't look away. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.